Welcome back to Agile University. This is the second module of the Defining Effective User Stories course series. To recap, in the first User Stories Fundamentals module, we discussed basic concepts surrounding user stories. You should now be able to recognize how user stories are derived from themes and epics, describe a user story template and its components, and know how to correctly format a user story summary and description. Now, we will cover an essential component of user stories that caps off the writing process, the acceptance criteria. Let's revisit the user story template that we introduced in the last module and dive into the acceptance criteria portion. Recall that the user story description is composed of the role, goal, and benefit, and these components describe the who, the what, and the why of the functionality described in the user story. A set of acceptance criteria follows these three components of the story summary and lists all of the features and functionalities that must be developed and implemented in order for the stated goal and benefit to be complete, turned into software, and working as intended. The acceptance criteria are conditions of satisfaction and must indicate a clear pass-fail result. These statements are the heart of the user story, the most critical part, as these are the only testable portions of the user story and are how teams are able to develop the working software and functionalities that the users desire. At HHSC, the development team assists the product owner in formulating accurate acceptance criteria by making sure the criteria are testable and demonstrable. This means the criteria should be easily translated into one or more manual or automated test cases. The acceptance criteria should also be written in clear and simple language and with the least amount of technical jargon possible. It should be written in a manner so that a person with basic Agile knowledge can understand the language and distinguish the purpose of each criterion. Because acceptance criteria serve as official artifacts to support contract requirements, they must be signed off by the product owner during the sprint planning meeting at the beginning of the sprint, as well as during the final sprint review after the 4-week sprint has been completed. Now that you know the acceptance criteria basics, let's put your knowledge into action and discuss an example. Recall the user story example that we walked through in our first module. Take a few seconds to think about and jot down what a potential acceptance criterion for this user story may be. Great! This is what I came up with as possible acceptance criteria. Pull all ELDS information on a client when renewal application is triggered. Client renewal application should show all information in tiers about their case. Client renewal application should include language that the application should only be returned if there is changed information on a client's case. As you can see, these three criteria are all testable and demonstrable and will make possible the user story's goal of responding only if there are changes to the current case. In addition to being testable and demonstrable, user stories and their acceptance criteria must also meet the INVEST guidelines. These guidelines have been discussed in various other HHSC Agile trainings, such as the Agile Fundamentals video series, and are very crucial guidelines to follow when writing an effective user story. Can you recall what each letter in INVEST stands for? Each of the individual guidelines within INVEST applies to different levels of the user story. Let's see if you recall the guidelines correctly and test out our user story to see if it meets these guidelines. The I, meaning independent, looks at the overall user story and asks, is the user story an independent, granular objective on its own? Yes, our our user story only focuses on the correspondence a client will receive. The N, meaning negotiable, looks at individual acceptance criteria and asks, are the acceptance criteria too specific, or did they leave enough room for discussion and refinement between the development team and the product owner later on? Yes, our acceptance criteria are not too detailed and will allow the development team and the product owner to have room for further discussion and adjustments. The V, meaning valuable, looks at the overall user story and asks, does this story bring value to the end user? Definitely. Our story will save clients time by not having them fill out an entire renewal application if there are no changes. The E, meaning estimatable, looks at the overall user story and asks, can we quantify at a high level the complexity and level of effort it will take to fulfill the user story? Team members usually have the planning poker method during the story point estimation process to determine a user story's estimatability. To learn more about the story point estimation process, please refer to the Agile Fundamentals video series. In our example, the user story is estimatable. The S, meaning small, looks at the overall user story including the acceptance criteria and asks, can this user story be completed in the duration of a sprint? In our example, the story is small enough and should not take longer than 2 to 3 weeks to complete. Finally, the T, meaning testable, looks at the set of acceptance criteria and asks, can this user story be coded and tested? Yes, each of our criteria is testable. While all INVEST principles are essential, it is most relevant to consider negotiable, small, and testable when writing acceptance criteria. By now, we have thoroughly discussed the 3 essential components of each user story template: the summary, the description, and the acceptance criteria. However, there are also other parts of the template that play useful and critical roles as well. They should be considered before deeming a user story complete. First, the Moscow rating portion is a way to assign a preliminary priority level to a user story. Moscow stands for must have, should have, could have, and won't have. This rating can only be determined by the business. So, this field can be left blank at the initial creation of the user story and filled in later on once the business designates a rating. Moscow is important to the user story development process as it challenges teams to think about what is truly most important when completing the objectives of a project. Second, the attachment portion serves as an illustrative and supporting role and can be very helpful in assisting teams to fulfill the user's vision for an end working software. This section can be used for attaching images or PDF files that convey the desired end state in image form as outlined by the acceptance criteria. These images can help teams visualize the user's desired end goal. The section can also be used for attaching supporting documentation, such as mapping spreadsheets or web service specs, to help teams further understand the context and information surrounding the user story. Next is the Assumptions, Risks, Unknowns section, which is just what it sounds like. It details all of the assumptions, risks, and unknown factors that may be derived from a user story. It is very important to brainstorm any assumptions considered when writing the story or any risks that may result from the story. Taking the step to fill this part out can prevent issues that may emerge later on in the sprint cycle. Finally, we have the Supported Scenarios section. While this portion is often left blank, when used, it is very important and provides additional explanation for complex user story scenarios. Well, it seems like we've covered most of everything relating to user story development. You should now be ready to tackle the process of writing and defining effective user stories.